The Argonaut shook, a tremor that ran through the deck plating and up into the soles of my boots. It wasn't the clean, controlled burn of the maneuvering thrusters, but a deeper vibration, the kind that set the bulkheads groaning like a tortured beast, a metallic shriek of stressed alloys. Old ships always have their quirks, the kind of groans and complaints you only get from metal fatigue and too many hard burns. After 20 years in the Foundation's service, jumping from one anomaly to the next, I've learned to speak the language of stressed bulkheads and failing systems. This one spoke of deep space weariness. Or maybe that was just me, projecting my own brand of weariness onto the ship. Space does that to you. It strips away everything but the essentials, leaves you alone with the silence and the vast, uncaring void. A void that doesn't care if you are a decorated veteran of mobile task force operations or a green recruit on their first salvage run. I gripped the edge of the viewport, knuckles white against the worn metal. Before us, the Heimdall drifted, a colossal monument to a forgotten dream. Even from this distance, it was a breathtaking sight. A generation ship, they called it. A self-sustaining ark designed to carry thousands across the gulf between stars. A journey that, judging by the derelict's current state, never reached its destination. The Foundation had picked up its distress beacon, a faint, automated signal lost in the cosmic background radiation. Now it was our job to find out what happened, to pick through the bones of a dead dream and see if there was anything worth salvaging, to see if there was anything worth burying deeper too. That was the Foundation's real mandate. We did what was necessary. We secured, we contained, we protected. Even if it was ourselves we were protecting it all from. Not that command ever put it in those terms. "You all right, Sarge?" Captain Shaw's voice, calm and measured, cut through the silence. He always sounded like that, even when we were knee-deep in an X-ray designated anomaly during my MTF days. Back when we were both wet behind the ears, chasing things that went bump in the night. Now he was a seasoned captain, and I was an old warhorse put out to pasture. Salvage detail. A far cry from the glory days, but it kept me in the game. And it kept food in my stomach and a roof over my head. "Just admiring the view, Captain," I replied. "She's a big one." "Biggest I've ever seen," Shaw agreed, joining me at the viewport. He was a few inches shorter than me, compact and wiry, with the kind of quiet intensity that made you think twice before crossing him. Makes you wonder what they were thinking, launching something this size. "Hope, maybe," I offered. "Same thing that drives us, I suppose." He made a non-committal noise in the back of his throat. "Something like that, Sarge," he replied. I never could get a read on Shaw. He was a closed book. The Heimdall was a city in space, a swirling helix of interconnected modules that spiraled around a central axis. The ship was a kilometer long if it was an inch. Hydroponics, engineering, residential zones, everything they needed to survive the long journey. But the closer we got, the more apparent the damage became. Pockmarks cratered its surface, evidence of micrometeoroid impacts, and long, jagged tears in the hull plating hinted at a more catastrophic event. And then there was the corrosion. Great swathes of the ship's surface were eaten away, a mottled black decay that seemed to spread like a disease. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A kind of accelerated entropy that seemed to defy the natural order. Shaw was giving the mission briefing, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped confines of the Argonaut's bridge. Besides me and Shaw, there were three others. Tyler, our tech specialist, a wiry, nervous guy who constantly fidgeted with his equipment. Powell, our comms and navigation officer, a quiet, steady presence behind his console. And Peterson, our weapons and engineering expert, a mountain of a man. "The Heimdall's logs are fragmented," Shaw explained. "But what we've been able to piece together is this. They encountered something mid-journey, something they referred to as the Corroder." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. It was an apt description judging by the state of the ship. Their initial scans indicated an object of unknown origin and composition. High energy readings, unusual gravitational fluctuations, but nothing that prepared them for its actual capabilities. The entity demonstrated an ability to manipulate its density on a molecular level, allowing it to pass through solid matter. Walls, bulkheads, it made no difference. And it left behind this. He gestured to the image displayed on the main screen, a close-up of the corrosion. This residue. Composition is still undetermined, but it's highly corrosive to all known materials, causes hallucinations on contact, vivid and realistic, sensations of decay, rot, the whole 9 yards. The logs describe a metallic taste in the mouth, extreme localized drops in temperature, that sort of thing. Tyler's leg bounced nervously. Sir, given the state of the ship, is it possible this corroder is still a factor? The logs don't exactly specify what happened to it in the end. Shaw looked straight at him. That's one of the things we're here to find out. We need to determine the potential for any residual threat, and to retrieve any data they might have on the entity, and this phenomenon they encountered. The logs refer to it as a pocket dimension, a region of space-time with anomalous properties, seemingly connected to the corroder's abilities. They believed it was a source of energy, and their research suggests they were attempting to interface with it directly. That's all we have right now. He turned to me. Collins, I want you to lead the boarding team. Standard precautions, full environmental suits. We don't know what the atmosphere is like on board, but assume the worst. Understood, Captain, I replied. I'd been on enough boarding actions to know the drill, and I'd seen enough anomalies to know that standard precautions often weren't enough. I glanced at the other members of the team. They all looked a bit green around the gills. I didn't blame them. I was sure I wasn't radiating confidence at the moment either. As we approached the docking clamps, the Heimdall seemed to grow even larger, swallowing the stars around it. It was a metal leviathan, a tomb for 1,000 lost souls, and we were about to breach its hull, entering through the docking port like parasites burrowing into a carcass. The docking procedure was tense. The Heimdall's systems were unresponsive, and we had to manually override the docking clamps. Peterson, with his expertise in engineering, guided us through the process, his voice a reassuring presence in the tense silence. Finally, with a shudder and a clang, the two ships were connected. All right, people, Shaw's voice came over the comms. Let's do this by the book. Collins, you have the lead. Remember your training, and watch each other's backs. He paused for a beat. Initial scans indicate the Heimdall has a residual atmosphere. Thin, likely not breathable for prolonged periods, but it's there. Keep your suits on, but you can switch to filtered intake once we're inside. Saves on oxygen, and it'll give us a better sense of the environment. Just be ready to switch back to internal if the air quality drops too much or if we encounter any obvious hazards. Let's move. We suited up in the airlock, the hiss of the seals a counterpoint to the silence of the Heimdall. The environmental suits were bulky and restrictive, but they were our lifeline. They offered some protection against the corrosive residue, and they had their own independent oxygen supply, enough for a few hours at least. A digital display on my HUD counted down the minutes of air I had remaining. I could see the other members of the team reflected in my visor. Tyler, in particular, looked like he was about to be sick. He kept running his tongue along his teeth. You all right, Tyler? He swallowed hard. Yes, Sarge. Just peachy. He forced a weak smile. Just another day at the office, right? I saw him adjust the light on his helmet, increasing the lumens. Just stick close, I told him, and try not to touch anything, especially not the walls. We cycled through the airlock and into the Heimdall. The first thing that registered was the change in air pressure. My suit hissed slightly as it adjusted to the lower pressure inside the derelict. The airlock door closed behind us with a heavy thud, sealing us in. My boots automatically clamped to the deck as the artificial gravity failed to engage. I switched my suit from internal oxygen to filtered intake. A slight hiss, and the ship's atmosphere, scrubbed clean by the filters, filled my helmet. The air felt lifeless, devoid of any scent. Despite the emergency lights, visibility was poor. The air itself seemed to absorb the light, a hazy, indistinct quality that made it difficult to judge distances. We moved slowly through the deserted corridors. The Heimdall was a ghost ship, a labyrinth of empty rooms and silent machinery. We passed through vast hydroponics bays where the withered remains of long-dead plants hung like macabre decorations. We saw crew quarters, frozen in time, with personal effects scattered about, as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. It was like walking through a museum, a monument to a lost civilization. But this museum was filled with an undercurrent of wrongness. The corrosion was everywhere, eating away at the walls, the floors, the ceilings. It spread like a cancer, consuming everything in its path. It wasn't until we reached the residential section that we found the first signs of the crew, or rather, what was left of them. In one of the larger common areas, a space that might have once been a mess hall or a recreation room, we came across a pile of what looked like discarded clothing. But as we got closer, the details became sickeningly clear. The clothing was fused together, hardened and discolored, and within the folds we could make out the unmistakable shapes of bones. Not just a few scattered fragments, but entire skeletons, intertwined and compressed, as if they had been melted together and then rapidly cooled. The fabric of their uniforms was bonded to the bone in a way that defied any natural process of decay. "What in the—" Peterson breathed, his voice unusually quiet. I knelt beside the remains, my light illuminating the grotesque details. The bones were brittle, almost fossilized, and they crumbled at the slightest touch. There were no signs of violence, no blaster marks or broken bones. It was as if their bodies had simply collapsed in on themselves, the flesh and organs consumed, leaving only a skeletal framework encased in hardened clothing. But the position of the bones. Too many in one place, too close together, like they had all tried to merge together into one being. It was deeply unsettling. Shaw joined me, his face grim. "The corroder does more than just eat through metal," he said. "It affects organic matter too. The logs mentioned rapid cellular degradation, extreme dehydration. This looks like the end result." It was clear what had happened here. The crew members had succumbed to the corroder's effects, their bodies breaking down at a molecular level, their remains fused together in a macabre monument to the entity's power. This wasn't just death, it was a complete and utter disintegration, a reduction to the most basic elements. We continued our exploration, the image of the fused remains seared into our minds. It was near the engineering section that we found the first traces of the black, thick substance. It clung to the walls, a greasy, shimmering slick that absorbed the light from our lamps, even more so than the surrounding darkness of the ship's interior. It was thick, like congealed oil. "That's it," Tyler said, his voice trembling slightly. "That's the stuff the logs described. The residue." I examined it closely, careful not to touch it. It didn't just corrode, it seemed to consume, to break down matter at a fundamental level. A bead of the substance dripped from the wall slowly, like some kind of viscous tar, and we all took a step back. "Don't touch it," I reiterated, stating the obvious. "And keep an eye out for more. If this is what's left behind—" My voice trailed off. I didn't need to finish the sentence. As we moved deeper into the ship, the evidence of the crew's struggle became more apparent. We found barricades made of furniture and equipment, hastily erected in a desperate attempt to slow down the entity. We saw signs of struggle, scorch marks on the walls and spent shell casings on the floor. And we found more bodies. They were little more than skeletons now, their flesh and organs consumed by the corrosive substance. Some were clad in the tattered remains of their uniforms, others were naked, their bones blackened and brittle. They lay where they had fallen, frozen in their final moments of terror. It was a grim tableau, capturing the crew's desperate struggle against an enemy they couldn't understand, let alone defeat. The crew had tried to fight back, tried to contain the corroder, but they had failed. And now we were walking in their footsteps, following their path to its inevitable, gruesome conclusion. We kept going, following the trail of destruction left by the Corroder. We found the ship's main computer core, a room filled with dark server racks. The room was in a state of advanced decay, the corrosion having eaten through most of the equipment. But the central data core, protected by a thick layer of lead shielding, was still intact. It seems the crew of the Heimdall knew about that weakness. "Jackpot," Powell said. "Let's see if we can get this thing working." It took several hours, but Powell, with his expertise in computer systems, managed to coax the data core back to life. The system was old and clunky, but it was still functional. We began to download the Heimdall's logs, piecing together the final days of the crew. The logs were a chronicle of despair, a descent into madness. They told of the crew's initial excitement at encountering the Corroder, their attempts to study it, and their growing horror as they realized its true nature. They described the entity's abilities, its corrosive touch, its ability to phase through solid matter, and the terrifying hallucinations it induced. They spoke of the pocket dimension, the strange non-Euclidean space that the Corroder seemed to inhabit, and their failed attempts to harness its energy. The crew had believed the pocket dimension was the key to faster-than-light travel, a way to shorten their long journey. But they had been wrong. It was a trap, a hunter's snare, and they had sprung it themselves. The Heimdall's crew had been scientists, explorers, pioneers. They were not soldiers. They were not trained to fight. And yet, they had faced the Corroder with courage and determination. They had tried to protect their ship, their people. They had failed, but they had not given up. They had fought until the bitter end. I found myself drawn to the personal logs of the Heimdall's captain, a man named Arthur Clayton. He was a thoughtful, introspective man, a scientist at heart, not a soldier. He wrote of his hopes for the mission, his dreams of a new home among the stars. He also wrote of his doubts, his fears, his growing sense of unease as the Corroder's presence began to warp the ship and its crew. "We were fools," he wrote in one of his final entries. "We thought we could harness its power. But we were wrong. It's not a tool, it's a force of nature, and we are nothing in its presence. We have unleashed something terrible upon ourselves, and I fear we may have doomed us all." His last entry was dated only a few hours before the ship went silent. It simply read, "It's in the walls." I could only imagine his last hours. The crew, as a whole, slowly being picked off one by one as they tried to survive the onslaught. The proximity alarm on my heads-up display flared, a stark, red visual cue that flashed insistently across my visor. I scanned the control room, my focus still on the decaying data core and the scattered logs of Captain Clayton. The team was huddled around Powell, who was still coaxing the ancient computer system. I keyed my comm, my voice tight and controlled. "Contact, bearing 095, closing fast." We were trained for this, drilled for it 1,000 times. But simulations and drills were one thing, the real deal was something else entirely. The men reacted instantly, their movements precise and economical, no wasted motion, no panic. Peterson moved his thumb to activate the charging sequence on his high-energy laser projector, while Powell secured his carbine. The proximity alert continued its insistent flashing. Whatever it was close. The far bulkhead, already weakened by the pervasive corrosion, began to warp and distort. The metal groaned, a tortured shriek that echoed through the control room. A section of the wall about the size of a man turned translucent, then semi-solid, as if the matter was losing its cohesion on a molecular level, like ice turning into water. And then it stepped through, or rather it flowed through, the Corroder. It wasn't just an entity, it was a violation of the natural order. It stood, or rather coalesced before us, a figure of unimaginable decay. It resembled an old man, tall and gaunt, but its flesh was a patchwork of rotted tissue and exposed bone. Its eyes were sunken pits, devoid of any light, any life, yet they seemed to fix on each of us with chilling intensity. It was like staring into the abyss itself. The entity was a dark, mottled grey, the colour of week-old roadkill. The air around it shimmered, not with heat, but with a kind of negative energy, a tangible coldness that radiated outward. The temperature sensors on my suit plummeted, the digital readout flashing a warning. A thick, black, viscous substance dripped from its form, pooling on the floor where it immediately began to eat away at the metal, producing a hiss and a foul, acrid smell that even my suit's filters couldn't completely block out. The scent was overpowering, like burnt plastic and ammonia, mixed with something indefinably organic, like a festering wound. It was the smell of death, concentrated and weaponized. A coppery taste flooded my mouth, triggering my gag reflex. Shaw's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the comm system. "Internal oxygen now. Filters are compromised." My hand immediately went to the oxygen selector on my suit, switching from filtered intake to the internal supply. I heard the others doing the same, a chorus of clicks and hisses as their suits sealed off from the increasingly toxic atmosphere of the Heimdall. Peterson raised his high-energy laser projector, a bulky, shoulder-mounted weapon with a thick, focusing lens and a series of heat sinks running along its side. It was more commonly used for cutting through reinforced bulkheads or for precision demolition, but in this case, it was our best hope against the Corroder. The projector emitted a high-pitched whine as it powered up, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. A brilliant beam of crimson energy lanced out, striking the Corroder square in the chest. The entity's form rippled and distorted where the beam made contact, its outline blurring, as if its very existence was being challenged. It hissed, a sound of pure displeasure, like air escaping a punctured tire, but amplified 100-fold. The beam didn't burn or melt. Instead, it seemed to disrupt the entity's cohesion, forcing it to expend energy to maintain its form. Peterson swept the beam across the Corroder, strafing it. But the effect was only temporary. While the beam clearly caused the entity discomfort and disrupted its form, it didn't inflict any lasting damage. It was like trying to wound a shadow. The form would waver, but then quickly coalesce back to its original state. It was clear that the projector was not a weapon that could destroy the Corroder, merely one that could buy us precious seconds. The entity started moving toward us, its gait slow but deliberate. Each step was measured, precise, yet it seemed to traverse the distance without any discernible effort, its feet barely touching the floor. Its limbs moved with a disquieting grace, each joint articulating in a way that seemed to defy the normal constraints of anatomy, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. The temperature continued to drop, the digital readout on my HUD plummeting further, and frost began to form on the exterior of my visor, obscuring my vision. Powell brought his carbine up, sighting down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger in controlled bursts. The weapon spat a stream of high-velocity rounds. The bullets, designed to penetrate heavy armor, had no discernible effect on the Corroder. They passed straight through, leaving no visible wounds, no sign of impact. It was like trying to shoot a cloud of smoke. Tyler, his eyes glued to his scanner, muttered, "It's phasing, not fully materialized." Shaw's eyes scanned the room, evaluating. He pointed a directive toward our floodlights. "Use the floodlights, full spectrum." We scrambled for our floodlights, powerful portable units designed to illuminate large areas. I switched mine on, the beam cutting through the gloom like a physical thing, and aimed it directly at the entity. The Corroder recoiled, shielding its face with a skeletal hand. It hissed again, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. The light seemed to cause it pain, to disrupt its form, its cohesion. Where the light touched it, its form rippled and distorted, like a reflection in disturbed water. We formed a loose semicircle around the entity, keeping it bathed in the harsh glare of our floodlights. It was a temporary reprieve, a brief moment of control in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. But we knew it wouldn't last. We were trapped, cornered in a decaying control room with an entity that could walk through walls and shrug off conventional weapons fire. The Corroder began to circle us, its movements slow like a predator toying with its prey. It probed our defenses, testing the limits of our floodlights, searching for a weakness. Then, without warning, it shot forward. It moved with blinding speed, one moment a distant figure, the next a terrifying presence right in front of us. It reached out with a skeletal hand, its touch promising oblivion. Powell, who was closest, reacted instinctively, raising his carbine to block the blow. It was a fatal mistake. The moment the entity's hand made contact with the weapon, the metal began to corrode, to decay at an accelerated rate. The carbine crumbled to dust in Powell's hands, and the corrosive touch continued, spreading to his arm, his suit, his flesh. Powell let out a short, choked cry, cut short as the decay spread to his throat, his lungs. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing, his flesh dissolving into a black, viscous sludge. It was a horrific sight. His short cry echoed for a few more seconds before being replaced by the quiet gurgling of his dissolving flesh. Tyler swung his floodlight towards the entity, directing the beam. The harsh, focused light struck the Corroder, momentarily catching it by surprise. It recoiled slightly from the beam, its form flickering where the light made contact, but quickly recovered and turned its attention to Tyler, its shadowed, empty eye sockets somehow conveying a focused menace. Shaw's eyes darted to the data core housing, his focus settling on the thick panels surrounding it. "Collins, the shielding, it's made of lead. The logs indicated it interferes with its abilities." He was right. The Heimdall's crew had discovered that lead somehow disrupted the Corroder's ability to phase. The data core itself was likely too cumbersome to move, but the heavy lead panels that shielded it, those were our best bet. I pointed towards the housing. "Peterson, help me with these panels. Tyler, keep its attention." I sprinted towards the data core housing, Peterson following close behind. The entity, distracted by Tyler and his focused beam, didn't immediately pursue. It stalked towards Tyler slowly, like it was savoring his terror. We reached the data core housing, a large cylindrical structure in the center of the room, encased in thick, overlapping panels of lead designed to protect the sensitive electronics within. The panels were heavy, each one a solid slab of metal, but they were equipped with emergency release handles, designed for quick access in case of maintenance. "Grab a handle," I ordered, my voice tight with exertion. I gripped one of the handles, my gloved fingers finding purchase. Peterson did the same on the opposite side of the panel. We pulled in unison, and the first panel detached from the housing, clanging heavily to the floor. It was a large, awkward sheet of lead, but it was manageable. I gestured urgently with the panel. "Tyler, Shaw, this way!" They scrambled back towards us, keeping their floodlights trained on the entity. The Corroder, realizing our intent, attacked again, its movements faster now, more aggressive. We positioned ourselves between the entity and the others, holding the detached panel like a shield. The Corroder, caught off guard, collided with the panel. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity's form wavered, its movements becoming uncoordinated. It let out a hiss, a sound of pure frustration and pain, like metal grinding on metal. The panel seemed to ground it, to force it back into our reality, to make it solid, vulnerable. We formed a barrier, holding the panel between us and the Corroder. It thrashed and struggled, its corrosive touch eating away at the panel, leaving blackened, pitted marks on the surface. But it was contained for the moment. We could feel the vibrations as it slammed against the panel, a physical force we could actually resist. Tyler, emboldened by our small victory, stepped forward, his scanner still trained on the entity. He was muttering to himself, his eyes fixed on the readings. "The pocket dimension," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "It's connected to the pocket dimension. The energy readings are astronomical." He was right. The scanner was picking up a massive energy signature emanating from the entity, a signature that fluctuated in sync with its struggles. It was the same energy signature described in the Heimdall's logs, the energy of the pocket dimension. I reached out, trying to pull him back. "Tyler, get back! That's not our priority right now." But Tyler wasn't listening. He was lost in his own world, obsessed with the entity and the power it represented. He took another step closer, his scanner outstretched, as if he was trying to touch the corroder, to probe its very essence. He adjusted the frequency of his scanner again and again, cycling through different settings, desperately trying to find a setting that might have an effect. Shaw and I exchanged a worried look. It was clear that Tyler was beyond reason, lost in his scientific fervor. Before either of us could react, Tyler, in his single-minded pursuit of knowledge, had made a fatal error. He'd gotten too close. The corroder, though weakened, was still dangerous. It seized the opportunity, lashing out with blinding speed. Its hand, no longer fully incorporeal, connected with Tyler's arm, and the corrosive touch spread like a virus. Tyler let out a short, choked cry, a chilling, heart-wrenching sound. He stumbled backward, clutching at his arm, his flesh dissolving into a black, bubbling mess. The scanner clattered to the floor, its light extinguished. We abandoned the data core housing, leaving the corroder momentarily pinned, and fled the control room, Peterson alongside us. We followed the path we had cleared earlier, a desperate scramble back towards the airlock, back towards the Argonaut, back to safety. We bolted through the corridors, our heavy footfalls muffled by the decaying, uneven deck plating. Each step felt precarious, threatening to send us sprawling as the artificial gravity fluctuated erratically. The only sounds were the wheezing gasps for air that punctuated our shared comm channel and the occasional metallic groan of the ship protesting our escape. Powell and Tyler were constantly on my mind, their final moments a grim tableau playing on repeat, fueling my desperate flight. We had to keep moving, had to put distance between ourselves and the horror that had taken them. We reached the airlock, the heavy metal door, a welcome sight. Peterson worked the controls, his movements precise despite the adrenaline surging through our veins. The outer door hissed shut, sealing us off from the horrors of the Heimdall. We were through. We had made it. The journey back to the Argonaut was a silent one. We had escaped the immediate danger, but the encounter had taken its toll. We were physically and emotionally drained, the memory of our losses a tangible burden. I could see it in Shaw's eyes, the haunted look of a leader who had lost good men under his command. It was a look I knew well. Once inside the Argonaut, the heavy airlock door sealed shut behind us. We were out. We had survived. But the silence that followed was not one of relief, but of profound exhaustion and a deep, unsettling awareness of our losses. The ship's AI initiated the decontamination cycle. A fine mist filled the airlock, a broad-spectrum biocide intended to eliminate any foreign matter, any lingering trace of the Heimdall, of the Corroder. We stripped out of our suits, the silence broken only by the hiss of escaping air and the clink of metal on metal. Each movement was mechanical, as if we were all operating on autopilot, our bodies moving but our minds still trapped back on the Heimdall, amidst the corrosion and the darkness. Shaw stood by the airlock door, his back to us, his hand resting on the metal. He hadn't said a word since we'd left the Heimdall. I knew he was replaying the mission in his head, analyzing every decision, every order, searching for a way he could have saved Powell and Tyler. It was a burden every leader carried, the weight of the lives entrusted to them. The journey back to Foundation headquarters was a silent one. We arrived at the Foundation's primary orbital facility, a sprawling complex of interconnected modules and docking bays. But there was no triumphant fanfare, no welcoming committee. Just the cold efficiency of the docking procedure and the grim faces of the quarantine crew waiting for us on the other side. They were clad in full hazmat suits, their faces obscured by opaque visors. We were ushered into the isolation ward, a stark white room with nothing but a few cots, a sanitation station, and a single reinforced observation window. We were safe from the Corroder, but now we were under the scrutiny of the Foundation, our bodies and minds subject to their rigorous protocols. The quarantine lasted for 72 hours. 3 days of monotony, punctuated by medical examinations and psychological evaluations. They drew blood, ran scans, and probed our minds, searching for any lingering effects of the Corroder's influence, any physical or mental contamination. The doctors were thorough, their questions probing, their methods invasive. They were particularly interested in my exposure, given I had been closest when the Corroder got him. I told them everything I could remember, every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. But it was the psychological evaluations that were the most unsettling. They probed into our memories, our fears, our nightmares, searching for any sign of trauma, any hint that the Corroder had left its mark on our minds. They showed us images, played sounds, trying to trigger a reaction, to see if we were still susceptible to the entity's influence. "Describe what you're feeling, Sergeant Major," the psychologist would say, his voice calm and detached, his eyes fixed on me from behind the observation window. "Tell me about the fear. Tell me about the darkness." And I would try. I would try to articulate the horror, to explain what it was like to see a man's flesh turn to liquid tar. I tried to describe the way the Corroder moved, not with muscles and sinews, but with a disjointed, flowing motion, like a puppet controlled by gravity, yet untethered by the need to remain attached. How could I make them understand the unsettling solidity of its stare, the way those empty sockets seemed to focus not on me, but through me, as if I were the insubstantial one, a ghost in its reality? They were not black, those eyes, not dark, but rather devoid of anything, like staring at two holes cut into the universe. Those eyes, still on me, in the darkness behind my closed eyelids, would remain, even when I tried to sleep, even when I tried to forget. The isolation, the constant scrutiny, the probing questions, it all began to wear on me. I found myself pacing the confines of the room, unable to sleep. The images of the Heimdall, of Powell and Tyler, playing over and over again in my mind. I saw their faces in the reflective surface of the observation window, heard their cries in the hum of the ventilation system. The sterile environment, designed to protect us, began to feel like a cage, a prison of our own making. It was in those long, sleepless nights that I began to truly understand the Foundation's methods, the cold, calculating logic that drove them. We were not just operatives, we were instruments, tools to be used and discarded in their pursuit of knowledge. They called us a mobile task force, but on that ship we were reduced to something far less. Test subjects, specimens to be studied, analyzed, and ultimately used to further their understanding of the anomalous. And in that room, I began to question, for the first time, whether the knowledge the Foundation was gaining was worth the price we were paying. The price they made us pay. The price men like Powell and Tyler paid with their lives. The Foundation seeks to contain, to protect, so they say, but at what cost, and to whom? The debriefing was held in a small, windowless room. Shaw and I sat across from a panel of 3 officers, their faces impassive. They were the faces of the Foundation, the men and women who made the hard decisions, the ones who sent people like us into the unknown. We recounted the events on the Heimdall, from the initial discovery of the logs to the Corroder's manifestation and our desperate escape. We described the entity's abilities, its corrosive touch, its ability to phase through matter, and its apparent weakness to lead and concentrated light. We told them about Tyler's intuitive flashes, his belief that the Corroder was connected to a pocket dimension, a source of immense energy. The panel listened in silence, their faces betraying nothing. When we were finished, the lead officer steepled his fingers and regarded us with a calculating look. "Your report is comprehensive. The loss of personnel is regrettable. You have provided valuable data on the entity, data that will be instrumental in its future containment." He paused, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Your exposure to the entity, Sergeant Major Collins, is of particular interest. We will need to conduct further tests, more in-depth analysis, to determine the full extent of its effects." I looked at him directly. "With all due respect, sir, I think we've given you everything we have. We faced something on that ship that we were not prepared for. We lost good men. We deserve to know why we were sent in there with so little information." The officer's expression remained unchanged. "What you deserve, Sergeant Major, is to follow orders. You were sent to retrieve data, and you succeeded. The entity's abilities were underestimated. That is a matter for the research division to address. Your role is to execute the mission, not to question the parameters." Shaw shifted in his seat, his voice low and controlled. "Sir, with all due respect, this entity poses a serious threat. Its ability to manifest through its residue alone makes it incredibly dangerous. The events on the Heimdall demonstrate a level of power we haven't encountered in any other anomaly. The Foundation needs to prioritize understanding and containing this threat." The officer waved a dismissive hand. "Your concerns are noted, Captain. We are aware of the potential risks. The entity will be designated SCP-106, and its containment procedures will be revised accordingly. The research division is already working on developing countermeasures based on your team's observations." He stood up, signaling the end of the debriefing. "You are both dismissed. You will be contacted if further information is required." In the days that followed, I underwent a battery of tests, physical and psychological. They probed my mind, searching for any lingering effects of the Corroder's influence. They found nothing, or at least nothing they were willing to share with me. I spent most of my time in the observation lounge, staring out at the vast expanse of space. It was a different view from the one on the Heimdall, but the sense of unease remained. The universe was full of anomalies, of things that defied explanation, things that could tear a hole in the fabric of reality. SCP-106 was just one of them. The official designation didn't change what it was, what it could do. A number and a file didn't make it any less terrifying. It was out there, somewhere, in the darkness between the stars, and I knew that we hadn't seen the last of it. The universe was a vast and ancient place, full of secrets that were perhaps best left undisturbed. We, in our hubris, had chosen to poke and prod at those secrets, to try and understand them, to control them. But some things are beyond our control. And sometimes, the price of knowledge is far greater than we could ever imagine. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not to face the unknown, but to turn away, to leave it in the darkness where it belonged. But that was not the Foundation's way, and by extension, not mine. I was left wondering, not for the first time, if we were the protectors of humanity, or the architects of its eventual doom. The stars, vast and silent, offered no answers. Only the chilling echo of a corroded ship and the men it consumed. They only offered the silence of the void,